Well, League of Legends was the most streamed video game on Twitch. That it is. When I looked at it, was the most watched stream on Twitch. I don't know if there's games that stream more often, but people were watching League of Legends more than. That's how we do it.
Okay. So Michael is out. Evan?
Here.
Oh, Michael is here. Cool. Chase? Brandon? Dawn? Michael? Yeah, you're here. Okay. Cody? David? Aaron? Danny is out. Josh is also out. Okay. So I'm going to fire up that Discord chat and go ahead and get that streaming. Okay, that should be up there. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few things today. So general overview, we'll be talking about kind of refresher of HTML and CSS. That's number one. Number two, we're going to talk a little bit about React, get introduced to it, kind of the background. And then the third kind of point today is we want to try to build something with it. So we're going to try building a shopping cart with React. And so we're going to do that together. So that's the kind of overview of what my plan is for today. So we'll take a little bit of time to get through here, cover here, and try to spend a little bit of time there. Tomorrow, I also want to go through another example. We'll finish this up if we don't finish up today. And we'll go through another example tomorrow with the pet adoption project that we started and kind of look at that and deal with like how do we build the login screen and the register screen and things like that. So that's where we're going. So it's been a little bit since we did anything with HTML, CSS. I know for my summer class, you guys kind of talked, we talked about it this summer and you've seen it then, but for everybody else, it's kind of been a year probably since you last did stuff with HTML, CSS really heavily. So I want to make sure that we kind of go over some of those fundamentals before we get into too much into React because it really relies on you understanding some of those things. So I've already kind of given a handout with all of the with some handouts. Those are from that I made for first semester, kind of summarizing some of the tags and some of the CSS attributes that you want to remember and utilize. So there's kind of a collection of 4 handouts there. One for HTML, one for CSS, a third short one for like Flexbox, and the last one about forms. There's a ton more information about those, and I'm going to talk about some of that, but that kind of maybe is helpful as a refresher. So in general, when we remember working with the front end, we're working with 3 different languages, right? So we're dealing with HTML, we're dealing with CSS, we're dealing with JavaScript. Things to remember is that, remember, HTML is defining the structure, okay? It's going to look a little bit different when we write the HTML with React, but it's still providing that underlying structure, okay? Our CSS is providing that styling, and then we're going to be using JavaScript for the interactivity. So those are the kind of the key points to remember there is how the kind of labor or the, as it might say, the concerns are divided, okay? So just to remind you about kind of the structure of a typical page, I'll blow this up a little bit. So typically we're going to have the whole thing contained, remember, in an HTML document. There'll be a doc type up at the top that says this is HTML5. We're going to have a head, we're going to have a body. Head, remember, is where we're going to put all the metadata kind of about the page. The body is where the actual content of the page lives. So large in part, the stuff that we're doing with React is all going to end up in that body. Okay, so there's a little bit of stuff we want to look at the head, but most of the stuff that we're dealing with React all kind of really goes into the body, and the rest is just a container. It's just a shell. So that's one thing to keep in mind there. Typically, you'll have your CSS files linked up there. You'll have your JavaScript files, remember, linked up there, or they may be down in the body as well. Okay. So we've got meta tags up there. We've got the title of the page. Commonly, you'll have like a header for the page, a name for the page, and footer for the page, with those newer, as we might say, semantic tags. Okay, so those are some of the parts that you'll just want to remember with that. Question so far? Is that kind of coming back? So,
Are you recording?
I am. I do have the recording going. Yes. So in terms of styling things with CSS, you'll also remember that there's a few different ways that we can apply those styles to the HTML. So we can either do that with inline styles, we can do that with embedded style sheets, we can do that with external style sheets. And things to remember, so inline style would be the style attribute on the tag itself. Embedded, if you're doing that, that would be the style tag that's up in the head. Or if you're doing external, that's in a separate CSS file, right? Now, there are some things that you may have seen, and there's different ways we may have used more in first semester, but we're going to kind of veer a little bit of a different way when we're working with React and kind of modern web development. So you may have learned inline styles are largely something you want to avoid. So anybody remember why? What are those reasons you wanted to avoid the inline styles? Right, that's one reason. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, so for instance, if you have like 5 different elements that all need the same style, they all need that. And that can mean more work, but it also actually means more data because there's more content, more HTML that's in it. So that can make the file size bigger. What else? You may remember the term RWD, responsive web design, right? And so remember, responsive web design relies a lot on media queries to change the styling, right? Change the styling based on the screen width. Okay, so one of the things you may or may not remember is that inline styles always have the highest precedence. They override absolutely everything else. So if you set something in an inline style, it doesn't matter what's in the spreadsheet. It's in the style sheet. It's going to be what's the style. So next up, you have the embedded style sheets, and the external style sheets are basically all at the same level. They're just run in the order that they get brought in. Okay. So the problem with inline styles is because they override the style sheet, they really conflict with responsive web design. You can't use them together with media queries, is one of the reasons. So that reason alone, because you can't override inline styles with a media query, is the main reason we don't use them. Does that make sense? So that's one part of that. The other part that we're dealing with, we're saying, hey, it can make it difficult for us to kind of divide the labor. So oftentimes we have like web developers and we have web designers, right? So we may have people that are focused on the functionality and making it work and the code kind of behind it, and they may be working from the front end all the way to the back end, whereas you may have more people that they're more web design focused, and what they know is just really the front end, okay? If we're using inline styles, that makes it a lot harder for those designers to come in and kind of tweak things, because you've got all these things hard-coded into the code. And specifically when we're dealing with React, that means hard-coded into the components. And so that means your inline styles are just kind of spread everywhere. Whereas our style sheets, we can kind of put them in one place. And then, we want to change the theme, we want to change the color scheme, whatever it is. I just have to change that one file. Does that make sense? So those are the kind of 2 main reasons there. Another kind of gotcha when we're working with React. React has a weird syntax when you do inline styles. The way that you typically represent them in HTML is not the same way that they're written in React. Okay, basically they're kind of written as an object, and you have to do a translation because, well, it's written in JavaScript, and JavaScript doesn't allow dashes in the identifiers, but there's an awful lot of properties in CSS that have dashes in them, right? So you're translating things from rather than what it would be in CSS. CSS you would have, say, margin dash bottom. You have to convert that over into the React world as margin bottom camel case. So that's how we write it in CSS, versus this is how we would have to write it with React over there, okay, over in the JavaScript world. Okay, so that causes some issues too, right? It makes things a lot harder to read and a lot harder to work with because you have to constantly do that translation. Okay, everybody good with that? So basically what that means is we really want to avoid using inline styles at all. Okay, we want to avoid using those, period. Next up, we might say, basically what I'm going to land on here is I think that what we should be using primarily is just external style sheets. Of those three options, basically the only one we're going to use with React is going to be external style sheets. Part of remember with the embedded style sheets, they're up in the head. Turns out we basically don't have much accessibility to change what's in the head. And the other thing that typically happens with React is we call it kind of a single page application, which means that all of your stuff is really running on a single HTML file. You're not actually changing the page. So you can't really just swap out and go to another page and swap out what's in the head, if that makes sense. So it's not really practical to just say, okay, well this CSS is for this page and this CSS is for this page. So our embedded style sheets don't really work. Does that make sense? If we're actually doing a page switch, then we could do embedded style sheets, because there's no actual page switch. We're really just stuck with external. So everybody good with that? That means all the CSS we do is going to be strictly with external style sheets for those reasons. Okay, so talking about how we bring in external style sheets, typically looks like this. If you're going to put it in the head, remember we're going to bring in a link tag. The relationship we have to set a style sheet, and we're going to have href as CSS, mean CSS, something like that. And those are the only outputs you have to set. Okay, so if you're doing it in HTML, that's the way we bring in an external style sheet. So we'll look a little bit different when we bring in React. Okay. So just some reminders. Also a reminder about how we structure that. So when we're looking at the content within those CSS files, remember they're typically structured by, hey, here's your selector. You say, what elements do you want to change? Within there, we're going to say this property is this value, right? So all of our rules, you'll remember, kind of follow that pattern. So what elements do we change? What property do you want to change? What value do you want to set them to? So common selectors, you may remember some of these, not all of these, but it's good to kind of go back and look at some of the things that are available. You'll remember if you use a star as a selector, that selects everything. We call it a universal selector. Okay, so if you want to say, hey, this particular thing applies to every element on the page, you do a star. We typically avoid that one because there's a cost to it. Another common gotcha is that they don't actually affect pseudo elements. And that's the things like colon, colon after, and colon, colon before. But other than that, it affects everything. That one we won't worry about too much, but it is worth pointing out that it's there. The next thing you can do is you can select an element by its type, just by spelling it out. So if you want to target all the buttons, you just say buttons, button, or if you want to target all the H1s, you just say H1, etc., etc., etc. Remember, if you started with a dash or dot, then you're targeting all the things with that class. If it starts with a hash, then you're targeting the thing with that ID. Okay. Typically, we prefer targeting our CSS classes over IDs because usually what happens is that that style that might be specific to just one thing on your website, usually over time becomes, maybe it appears multiple places, or it might move from one page to another, or you might need to change that ID for some reason. So usually we don't do very much of this, although we might use that selector in JavaScript. Okay? Okay. Other things in terms of relationships, you'll remember that you can target things related to other elements on the page. So if I say food space bar, that would be all the bars are within food somewhere at any level, right? So that might be, hey, I want all the inputs that are within a form. So I'd say form space input, right? So those are some things to remember there. Also, we can do direct descendant, as we say, or direct child, if you put the little greater than symbol in there. So you can say they're right at the same level, rather than they could be further down. Okay. We can also use a comma to say we want this or that. So I can say I want all the foods or all the bars, and it's worth mentioning that all of this can be kind of put together and positive. We can also say, hey, maybe I want to target the things that have focus and hover. I can do that with like this. We call that a pseudo class. We can say it's got the state of hover, state of focus. One reminder with that from an accessibility standpoint is we always want to give hover and focus typically the same style. Because if you're doing keyword only, then you're typically just seeing focus. If you're using the mouse, then you're going to see hover. If you're using a touch screen, you're probably just going to be seeing the focus styles. So that's why we kind of want to keep them in sync, because different input modes may use one, refer one over the other. Also worth mentioning in there is a focus within that says not just is this element the thing